for this year.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm glad to see some people got up in time for an 8:30. So this is the session on the future of working class movement building. I'm Betsy Leondar-Wright, and I'm going to moderate our three fabulous panelists. So I guess I'll introduce you one at a time when you're about to go. So our first speaker is Tamara Draut, who is the Vice President of Policy and Research at DEMOS, which you see the logo here, and Equal Say and Equal Chance for All. Tammy is the author of Strapped, Why America's 20 and 30-somethings Can't Get Ahead, and Sleeping Giant, How America's New Working Class Will Transform America.
All right, cool, thank you. All right, good morning. Good early morning. Wow. When she told me 8:30, I was like, really? So hats off to all of you for getting here. I'm proud of myself for getting here too, because I took 6 o'clock car to get here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about narrative and the important role it plays in building cross-racial movements. And one of the things we've been working hard at DEMOS on is entering into this debate. You might have been part of one of these debates about after 2016, we need to have a populist class message and jettison identity politics. Nope, we need to talk about race, race, race. We think we actually need to do both. That in order to have a progressive future, we actually have to deal with the toxic nature of the way race is used in our political debate right now. So that is what this project set out to do. And I'm going to breeze through this, but this is the climate we're in, right? This is dog whistle politics. And I highly recommend that book if you haven't read it by Ian Haney-Lopez. So this is not new. This is kind of the epitome and the logical conclusion of a decades-long political strategy that we have all been living under and been witnessing called the Southern Strategy, which really at its root was aimed at undermining working class solidarity by saying that white people were supporting a government whose benefits were primarily going to people of color. So, our goal was to help, first and foremost, we believe that the chart to a progressive majority has to start with our base. If our base doesn't show up, there is fundamentally no way we can ever win a ballot initiative for criminal justice reform, a ballot initiative for LGBTQ rights, a ballot initiative for minimum wage, tax policy, you name it, let alone the electoral arena and getting good people into office. So the goal was to say, how do we actually persuade the largest possible group of whites by appealing to our base first and foremost? Now this is a very different way of crafting a narrative. Oftentimes people will be like, how do we get all the white people? And hope that the base kind of comes along with us. So this starts with the base and says, what is the most motivating way we can talk to our base and bring the most possible number of whites around? So we set out to be two narratives. One, the opposition narrative, which is really persuasive and compelling, and a sort of colorblind economic populism message. Okay, so you know this. This is the core elements of the right-wing narrative. Racial fears are provoked. Your economic insecurity is due to pick a decade, new immigrants, black people, women on welfare, and that's why you should distrust government. And that's why we shouldn't fund government, because it goes to people who don't deserve it with your tax dollars. This is the element of ours. We have to establish some kind of cross-racial solidarity. We have to say that that is the way we get to shared prosperity and racial justice, and that government is a key lever in making all that good stuff happen. All right, so we did this huge longitudinal, or no, not a longitudinal survey. I would love to do that. We did a 2,000-person survey. After everybody took the survey, we oversampled African Americans, young people, drop-off white working class voters, and another oversample, forgetting which one. We did a cluster analysis. based on people's views on three sort of interrelated things, and these three questions tend to all stick together except for this group of persuadables. Whether you believe that getting ahead in life and being rich is because of luck or because of the system. Whether you believe having a conversation about race is detrimental to dealing with racism, or it's actually the conversation we need to have. Or whether you believe that government should get out of the way or actually has a role to play. So based on the way people identified or answered those questions, we put them into three buckets. Our base, you can think of them, they took this survey and they answered everything exactly the way we would want the world to look like. That's about 23% of the United States. More likely to be women, African American, and Latino. This is really important. These aren't Democrats, most of them are Democrats, but this is not a partisan breakdown. This is based on attitudes. Persuadables, that's the majority of the country, 6 out of 10 people. They really toggle between ideologies. If you say to them, government really should stay out of the way because it keeps us business from doing what it needs to do. Yep, sure does. And then you say to them, government has a really big role to play in providing equal opportunity. Yep, sure does. So those are the persuadables. And then we have our opposition. That's about almost 1 out of 5. We're not going to get these people, ever. Doesn't matter what we say. Well, it does matter what we say. To get them, we would have to say things that fundamentally don't reflect our core values. But we want to know how they're responding to our messages. And I'm going to talk about that a little later when I show you the messages. So this is the, and I'm not making fun of persuadables because this is the reality of human beings. We often hold very conflicting ideas at the same time. So these are the persuadables. Talking about race doesn't fix anything and makes things worse. Yep, if we give them that question, this was a split sample, so half of them got this question, the other half got the other. If we just say, actually, we need to talk about race, it's necessary, they say yes to that. So depending on what they're given, they say yes. They believe both these things. All right, so this is the opposition message we tested. This is what we need to be. This is you're going to hear it. Hopefully you don't like it, but it should be very familiar to you. And here you see these are the median ratings. So do you guys know what a dial test is? So you listen. So you listen. So the messages, people hear them. The respondents hear them, and they have a dial, and they turn it to the right to be like, yeah, I'm digging this. And then as soon as somebody says something you don't dig, you turn it back to the left. So what you're going to see is the lines tracking warmth and cold, warmth and cold. And the color coding here, you have base, opposition, persuadables, advocates, that's the other sample. I work in the progressive movement. If our people don't like what we're telling them to say, they're not going to say it. And if they don't say it, then voters aren't going to hear it. If they're not willing to knock on a door or stand in a park and give this rap, then it's never going to go anywhere. So we need to know that they like it. And then union members. The SEIU was a partner in this, and that was the oversample I forgot. We oversampled 600 union households, not just SEIU members, but all union households. So here we go, opposition message.
Our leaders must prioritize keeping us safe and ensuring that hardworking Americans have the freedom to prosper. Taking a second look at people coming from terrorist countries who wish us harm, or at people from places overrun with drugs and criminal gangs, is just common sense. And so is curbing illegal immigration, so our communities are no longer flooded with people who refuse to follow our laws. We need to make sure we take care of our own people first, especially the people who politicians have cast aside for too long to cater to whatever special interest groups line their pockets, yell the loudest, or riot in the street.
So the advocates are like, please God, turn this off, right? The base, digging it, working really well, but so are the persuadables in union households. They're like, yeah, okay, sure. And if you see the base, that's actually not a great number either. That's 54. That's kind of right in the middle. I'm not completely insulted, but I'm not really completely supportive either. All right, so the first message, this is a very, this is a real message. We cobbled this together from, you could look at things like Sanders' campaign, campaign, Fight for 15, basically really good economic populist message that, is great. Let's see how that does.
We live in the richest country in the history of the world, but that means little because much of that wealth is controlled by a tiny handful of individuals. Despite advancements in technology and productivity, millions of Americans are working longer hours for lower wages. Wall Street and the billionaire class have rigged the rules to redistribute wealth and income to the wealthiest and most powerful people of this country. We must send the message to these greedy billionaires that you cannot take advantage of all the benefits of America if you refuse to accept your responsibilities as Americans.
All right, so this is a little better. We're alienating the opposition, which is good. So remember, that's about, it's 18% of people. And here's the thing, if you ever hear a pollster say, and it tests well with the opposition, then you should not be saying it. Because it means you're saying nothing of substance. You're saying, as Anat Shanker, sorry, on her presentations, it's like saying to somebody, free pie. Okay. We're trying to get in a really complicated, contentious conversation here. And if the base, who's not with us, is digging what we're saying, chances are we're not saying the right thing. I'm sorry?
Oh, you said the base being, I think you meant
Oh, yes, I did. Thank you. See, this is what happens at 8:30 in the morning. Thank you. All right. So this is a good message. Does all the things we need. It's pointing people in the right direction. We've got the persuadables with us. A little bit better than the opposition message. So now what happens when we bring populism and race together?
No matter where we come from or what our color, most of us work hard for our families. But today, certain politicians and their greedy lobbyists hurt everyone by handing kickbacks to the rich, defunding our schools, and threatening our seniors with cuts to Medicare and Social Security. Then they turn around and point the finger for our hard times at poor families, black people, and new immigrants. We need to join together with people from all walks of life to fight for our future, just like we won better wages, safer workplaces, and civil rights in our past. By joining together, we can elect new leaders who work for all of us, not just the wealthy few.
All right, so in a longer presentation, I would show you a lineup of how this message did compared to the other ones. But the reality is this message did better than colorblind economic populism significantly. And all of the messages, we tested like 7 different messages that blended sort of race, class together, and they all outperformed the opposition, and they all outperformed colorblind populism. So, here's sort of the anatomy of this problem. We're having an internal debate right now at Demos about whether this sentence is actually discussing race overtly. I think it mentions race. I'm not sure it discusses race overtly, but it does say no matter what our color. Then, most importantly, it names racial scapegoating as a weapon used to divide us. Then it emphasizes unity and collective action, and this is so important. People are so with us on division. Like when we started these focus groups, everybody, what are you thinking about today? How are things going? Everybody talked about the amount of division in the country and are desperately seeking for somebody to unify them. And then finally, let's remind people that we can actually work across race to get good stuff to happen in this country again. And this is really important because when it comes to our base, the thing that we encounter the most is actually cynicism. People love our ideas, they just don't think there's any chance they're gonna happen. And so reminding people that yes, we actually did band together and do stuff is really important. And finally, connect to government. All right, we also did a test where we gave another split sample where we just, standard sort of conservative line to make life better, we need to cut taxes, reduce regulations, and get government out of the way. And then we divided, half the sample got the blue message, half the sample got the green message. And the blue message we add in to make life better for working people, good stuff we all want, for white, black, and brown people, compared to no mention of race. When we said white, black, and brown people, we actually got more support among persuadables. Now, important note about this, because everybody asked us in this presentation. They say, are you sure that this isn't an all lives matter thing? That when you say white, you're saying, oh, okay, you're including me. So what's not up here is that the opposition did not like this statement at all. Their rating on this tanked when we added white, black, and brown. The other thing, which I'm not going to go over, is we asked questions about, are you ready to do something in your community, or are you ready to work across racial lines? And working across racial lines actually garnered more support among persuadables and the base than working in your own community. So we're not worried that this is provoking sort of some kind of, all lives matter sentiment. All right, here's just how we did. All of, if you go to the Demos website, you can see all of the messages we tested. All of these messages did better than the opposition, and they all did better than the colorblind economic populist message. And that's it. Wow, I did it. Okay. Should I take questions or not?
Why don't we wait
Okay.
and
Great.
do questions for everybody?
Love it.
But,
All right.
Yeah.
See, that went so quickly.
Okay.
Okay.
I know.
Like, did I forget stuff?
We have enough light here. Can you see us up here?
When I go into demos.org, is it easy to find this?
Yes, it's right on the homepage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So our next speaker is my old friend George Lakey, who has been teaching people how to build powerful social movements since the Civil Rights Movement, maybe a little before. And he's the founder of the wonderful popular education training institute called Training for Change. And he's the creator of the Global Nonviolent Action Database. And the author of the most relevant of his books for working class studies is Viking Economics over there, How Scandinavians Got It Right and How We Can Too. He's got a forthcoming book that's called How to Win. Take it away, George.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Sorry. I'm so happy to follow you with that because it connects very much with what I was trying to say. So first of all, just a methodological thing. This has to do with the research that I've been doing in the Nordic countries. And the reason I've been doing it is because, well, there are a number of reasons, but one reason is because I spend a lot of time making a living as a consultant and trainer. And that's a profession that counts on best practices a lot. And on plane rides and stuff, I'd be talking to people from other professions, whatever, lawyers or doctors, whatever, and they'd all talk about best practices. And it seems like when you don't have a huge research foundation with tons of money to do somewhat more elaborate research, what you do is you find out, what are they doing over, about this hospital mortality rate for actually, what is that hospital doing that enables them to do so much better than our hospital is doing? It seems to be pretty much the currency in which people try to be empirical, but without a lot of money. Just farmers do the same thing. Why are more calves surviving for the farmer down the road than for me, right? Well, I'll find out what they're doing, right? So I thought, okay, well then let me look into the Nordic countries, not just in terms of what's their economic model that is so much more equitable than ours. What is the nature of that model, which is in the book, but also how did they get there? Because wouldn't it be interesting if some of what they did to get there actually turned out to be best practices that it would be excellent for us to do. Here's an assumption about best practices, that best practices don't happen simultaneously in all fields at the same moment, 2 o'clock in the afternoon or something, okay? That it happens for the farmer down the road first, and then this farmer finds out and tries, right? So it happens, my guess is, when the circumstances are optimal, and the right person at the right time, or somebody's just noticing, whoa, we made this this accident with this medication, but actually they got better faster. It could be that accidental, right? But anyway, it's particular circumstances create that unique best practice, but then others pick it up because it's best practice, right? Now that's very different from the way people think politically. I've spent a year and a half on the road with this book. And I say, so this is how they did things. And people immediately say, well, but that wouldn't work here because those are small countries and this is a large country. Or that wouldn't work, that wouldn't, right? So all the professions who, thank goodness, learned from best practices would never produce anything good for us because they'd all be busy saying, yeah, but it was New Yorkers who figured that out, and I'm from a small town, and I would never work in my town, or blah, 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 right? So I'm proceeding on the basis of, let's see, what can we say it, like appreciative inquiry or something. It's like, I'm actually curious about what happens there, because maybe it would work for me, and wouldn't that be cool? Rather than the automatic judgment, well, it happens somewhere else, in maybe, and it couldn't possibly happen here because we're different, we're unique, we're awesome, we're exceptional. Okay, so that's the assumption that I make. And let me, I need your help.
You start from that end. I'll start from this end.
Great. Oh, thank you. I'm always thumbs. So looking at, so I'm the only person who's been writing about these countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland, from the point of view of how did they get there, not just a snapshot of what they got, but how did they get there. And here's what I thought might be useful for you to consider today. That in the 20s and 30s, which is when they made their breakthroughs, especially I'll focus a lot on Norway and Sweden because they were the most parallel in terms of timing, huge discontent, huge polarization. And in the US, I thought an interesting comparison would be, because it's roughly the same time period, also huge polarization. Remember Father Coughlin, every week, well, you don't remember, but anyway, my dad remembered. Every week there was this Catholic priest preaching fascism, every week, weekly radio show, very, very popular, right? Ku Klux Klan up the wazoo, Nazis growing, tremendous polarization. And so we were doing the same thing as what was going on in Sweden and Norway in terms of polarization, and they made a breakthrough at that time, pushed their 1% out of dominance, and set themselves on the road of creating the economic Nordic model, what it's called. But we weren't able to go over the top. We made a lot of progress in the 30s, a lot of progress. At a time of polarization, in other words, polarization didn't slow them down. It didn't slow us down either. It was a tremendous opportunity, and it was used as an opportunity by the union movement and by sharecroppers in the South. Just lots of people used that as an opportunity. They didn't get depressed, in other words. They didn't worry about tweeting from somebody or other. They just went ahead and used their opportunity to make a great change. But we weren't able to go over the top meaning to push the 1% out, so we could actually create the society that I believe we deserve. We weren't able to do it because we didn't have the optimum circumstances that the Nordics had at that time. And so the opportunity for you in feedback when we get the chance to talk, and later in the day as well, is what's going on in the U.S. today with regard to Betsy and that growing polarization. Okay, vision. What was going on there was that they were able, the left was able to pretty much unite around the vision of democratic socialism. And so that's what they were pushing. Yes, there was a group of communists who were wanting a state, a very much more statist vision, but it was very minority compared with the broad, what seemed to the Nordics as more commonsensical way of proceeding. I won't go into the details of that, but anyway, they were able to present to the people in commonsensical ways a vision of very substantial change, transformational change is what they offered. We had three visions going. We had the communist vision. It was the heyday of the Communist Party in our country, and also we had the Democratic Socialists, right, Norman Thomas and so on, and then we also had FDR offering a vision that was very big change considering what the 20s had been like. And so we have 3 visions, they have 1 vision, and I'll be glad to get feedback from you. My impression is we don't have any vision being offered. The movement for Black Lives has offered a vision, and it is getting signed on to by some, but not nearly by, it's not being taken as seriously on the left as I think it needs to be taken. Nor is the left building a vision, and I think that has enormous consequences, but we'll talk about that. Okay, strong cooperatives, so that people were able to say, that's visionary in the sense of somebody's good idea. Damn, we're doing something about wealth retention through co-ops, and we're actually creating a new economy right now. And there was a lot of that in the 30s in the US as well, and there's a little bit of that going on here. There were strong middle class allies for the Swedes and Norwegians, especially for the Norwegians, in the 20s and 30s, and in the US to some degree, I would say fairly strong middle class allies of the most oppressed people. And then I think it's pretty weak at this time in terms of actual identification with those groups and really engaging in campaigns that make a difference. Which moves me to the next. In both the 30s for us and for across the sea, very big emphasis on campaigns, because campaigns are a way of taking diffuse energy and focusing it sharply enough actually to make specific gains. And for people who get depressed and despairing, which happens during polarization times, right? Like we experience that all the time right now here. Making actual concrete gains is phenomenal feedback loop. It's, oh, but at least we did this, or oh, at least we did that. Maybe we have some capaciousness. Maybe we have some power. We can actually deliver something. Oh, wouldn't that be amazing? Maybe we can deliver something more if we tackle something even more. And so the campaign route was the main route. It was not in Norway and Sweden a focus on parliament at all. They saw through their parliament, and they had parliament and free elections. It looked like democracy. They saw through it. They knew who was really running things, and they could see it was their 1%. And that's where the contest had to be directed, and it was not directed through the parliament. It was handy to have a parliamentary party representing them, because when they took over the country, it would be useful to have a parliament running the country. So it wasn't the instrumentality of having a parliament that was bad. It was the fact that it was actually the 1% that was in control. And they were constantly emphasizing that by constantly going after the 1% and exposing the 1%'s control. The nature of the campaigns very often did that. And that's what delivered the goods. And to a large degree, that was going on in the 30s in our country as well. Tremendous lot of campaigning that was going directly after the 1%, tremendous exposure of the 1%'s failures and why we shouldn't count on them. Nowadays, I think that we're fairly weak on that front as compared, say, to the 60s. Actually, we did much better on campaigning in the 60s. The civil rights movement we would not even talk about if they had not chosen to fight campaigns. We wouldn't even be talking about the civil rights movement if that had not been the major technology. It was the major technology used because the Democrats took such a long time to decide to co-opt the movement. So there's that period from 55 to 65 when the Democrats were almost as close as the Republicans. Well, actually in the 50s, they were more close than the Republicans to change through parliamentary measures. And therefore, it was up to the movement to shape itself for power through campaigns. And that's what delivered the goods. That's what made all that progress. Now, of course, the Democrats, it was really funny. I had a conversation in Maine with a guy running for governor, and this was a keynote for a statewide environmental thing, and I said, by the way, your environmental movement seems to be growing really well in Maine, so as it continues to grow in power, you can expect the Democrats to come around and co-opt you, because that's what they do. We have a two-party system. One party specializes in repression, the other party specializes in co-optation, And you'll have to make a decision. Do you want to be independent, or do you want to be co-opted? And co-optation means blah, 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 blah. And I said that knowing that this guy, running for governor, was in the room. In fact, there were a number of candidates there, all, soliciting support. And I looked at them as I was explaining this. So this guy comes over immediately after. He'd already served as Speaker of the House for two terms. So he was a TV model politician. Right? He comes over to me, he smiles, he says, George, I just want to say, I want to acknowledge, that's what we Democrats do. We co-opt grassroots movements. And we're good at it. So, fortunately, the Swedes and Norwegians saw through that bullshit, knew it was a paper democracy, knew what the co-optation factors were, and decided instead, we will be a grassroots movement that will retain its independence. We will take over, we will make a power shift, and we'll create a party that's accountable strictly to us to do the party job, because the party job needs to be done. Okay, and then finally, movement of movements, because in those countries were in fact divided, and they needed, in their case, rural, urban, it was industrial working class versus farmers, a big division that the 1% had played on for a long time. They were able to get both of those movements working together, and boom. And in the 30s, in the US, we also experienced some of that working together, especially the unemployed were able to be organized to be able to move in sync with the industrial working class. And again, it's for you to figure out. I don't see a movements happening yet. Hopefully soon. And I think the ingredients are there for it, but it's going to be tough going. It was the dream of Mayfield Randolph, and Bayard Rustin. Bayard was a big influence on me in the 60s, and of course Dr. King came onto that dream, but we were unable to make it the reality that it needed to be in order to really shift things. So that might be enough to provoke thinking. Was that my time?
Just about, exactly, yes.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if I might have an answer to movement of movements.
Yay!
I don't know. I'm just wondering.
You see while you plug yourself in. So this is my class action colleague, Tanya Williams, who is the founder and principal of Authentic Coaching and Consulting. And she's a transformational equity and social justice educator who wears many hats. Besides her own consulting firm, she's a co-lead facilitator for the Leadership Institute and a senior trainer with class action.
Thank you, Betsy.
Welcome in.
So, I'm different. I am so different. And I have that same feeling. I was talking earlier about how I come out of a oppression theory training, and we talk about systems and understanding. I was always the one who was talking about the individual and the stuff that goes on inside. And so when I say, there's a perspective in my mind that there is a movement of, I have a potential for an answer for a movement of movements, because some of the reasons, or one of the reasons that I think things haven't hooked is because of the ways in which internalized oppression plays itself out. And so, hidden in plain sight. I have committed myself to, after having some experiences, of really lifting my own consciousness to acknowledging and having a land acknowledgement for the native tribes and native peoples, indigenous peoples that had this land before us. And so I always try to introduce this. Clearly, you can't read down here, but I looked it up, and we are on the land of the Setauket people. And it feels important to me to do this because, again, I think in movements, in transformation, we've got to start owning the things that we have ignored. And so all of my workshops, I start with this place. So, questions that I considered when thinking about, how does a conversation about internalized classes and internalized racism fit into a conversation about working class movements. Why is exploring internalized racism and internalized classism important? Why is, and I don't know that I have the perfect answer, but it has intrigued me, so thank you for bringing me into this conversation. And then what makes it difficult to explore? So most of my work is looking at internalized racial subordination and domination, and I'll talk about it in a second. We use a lot of times when you hear internalized oppression, it's this big overarching thing that is talked about only from a subordinate place. And so it is the subordinate group who has internalized oppression. What I like to put forth is that actually, because we're swimming in the mess of oppression, we all have taken it in from our locations. And so to think about any kind of movement, I picture two fists coming at each other, so a dominant space and a subordinate place, and it meets. We play our roles in this place, and it meets in this space of oppression. And so oppression is using both of us to hold itself up. There's this wonderful image from a writer, Barbara Fletcher. She asked the question, how does oppression finally get defeated? And we think about oppression as a two-legged table, with one leg being the institutional. We think of the oppression that is embedded in all of our institutions, and the internalized oppression, the oppression that is embedded in us. We often work with the idea that, oh no, let's see if I can go back. We work with the idea that if we knock down the institutional first, oppression is going to die. I love that what she says is that this is actually the leg that we have control over. And so, not to say, and I've done this before, and people have said, well, do you mean that we should just stop working on all of the institutional oppression? It's like, no, but don't completely ignore that the internalized oppression is there. And I feel at times alone on this, because I think so many folks are looking out, and I'm the person going, but wait, it lives in us. It totally is living in us. And I can tell you story after story after story, and I probably will before we end, of the ways in which I've upheld my own oppression, being both a race working class person and an African American Black person in this country. I have upheld my oppression. The system didn't have to do anything for it because I was doing my own. And so, what are the ways from our different locations of dominant identities and subordinate identities that we're upholding that system? So, where we head is to a definition of internalized oppression. So it's about affecting within, and it's not just the taking in of stories or taking in of the beliefs, but really it's, Beverly Tatum talks about the breathing in of the air. We can't get out of this. If I had a little bit longer time, we'd talk a lot more about oppression, about liberation, but we're gonna go with what we have. What I know is that we both have been impacted. If there's no escape for me as a Black person, there's no escape for white people. And so really taking internalized oppression and breaking it up and exploring the ways in which we all have taken in from our different locations. So internalized subordination, definition that we use, or that I use, is that of Beverly Fletcher, and I've done some work with it. Internalized subordination results from oppressed groups of people being immersed in negative images of themselves and accepting, either consciously or unconsciously, truth, the misinformation, prejudicial perceptions, attitudes, behaviors, symbols, and stereotypes of the dominant group, and operating from that place of perceived inferiority and subordination. So I'm swimming in it, I can't get out of it, and I believe it. And therefore my actions come from all of those places. Now, the piece that I think people rarely think about is the internalized domination. And in the conversation about race and class, for race, it feels pretty simple, and we'll read this definition in a second, but for class, it moves, and that's where I'm gonna do more work around. So what do you do as I think about myself as a race working class person? I live a middle class life, I'm a straddler. There are some domination pieces that I have learned as well, but I'm also living in a internalized subordination place coming from. So how do those things end up working themselves out? Systemic attitudes and actions of prejudice, superiority, and self-righteousness of one group in relation to another. This system consists of patterns of perceptions, logic, symbol formation, thought, speech, action, emotional response as conducted in all areas of people activity. And so economics, education, entertainment, labor law, political, religion, sex, and war. Internalized dominance is the accepting as truth the dominance group superiority in all of these realms. And so this definition really gets at, there is no place where dominance has not been learned and lived out with groups that are in dominant positions in the system of oppression. Love this image and this quote. If it is the despot you would want to dethrone, see first that the throne erected within you is destroyed. So many of us are not taking a look at the throne inside, but really looking and saying everyone else is not doing their work, and it's like, so how am I actually buying into that myself? And Audre Lorde says, the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor, that which is planted in each of us. And so when I think about having movements work, and I think about the work that I get to do with organizations, it's these pieces that we're not paying attention to. I think we end up changing policy, we end up thinking about practice, but we forget that we actually have taken in some things around dominance and subordination that actually meet in these spots that continue to be a struggle for us. And so how can we begin to understand that in a deeper way? I want to skip. There are some things that I believe that I basically have told you all about. I'm going to come back with Audre Lorde. She says, without community, there is no liberation. I skip to this because it's recognizing, going back to what you said, that a working class movement is not going to work without everyone. But if everybody's present, and I feel your work has done this, that we are bringing our cultures, our class cultures with us, we're bringing our internalized domination and subordination with us. And so how do we, if we are not willing to do that internal reflection, it's never gonna hook. And so, and we know, and Audre tells us that liberation is not gonna come if we're not gonna be able to do this in collaboration and community. The thing, answering that second question that I had, what often holds us back is shame and fear. And Dr. Cornel West offers, once you break the back of fear, it's a new day for oppressed people. When we break the back of fear, it's a new day for us, and that is a spiritual point and a moral point. And so breaking the back of fear is mostly the work that I like to do with folks. And this is one of the ways that I try to do it. Dr. Robert Gass, who formerly of the Rockwood Institute, now with Social Transformation Project, talks about, has a wheel of change. Not only, he talks about it for organizations, but there's also one that he does with individuals. And really understanding that it will take our own inner work to explore our internalized oppression, the ways in which we do things rather than behavior change. It's going to actually take us to do some behavioral change and break the back of fear that, as Dr. West talks about. And then systemically, like what are the systems that exist in our lives? What are the things that we are doing on a regular basis that support our internalized depression, and how do we break that? And that is me. That's a lot.
Wow.
Wow. Wow.
Thank you, Tammy, George, and Tanya. I was thinking of being a discussant, but I have a feeling this is a room full of really good questions, and you all, if you could, you three could sit up here, and I'll moderate. I also want to encourage you to ask each other questions. That some dialogue among the panelists would be great. So,
I'm going to
You got it?
yeah.
Thank you.
So, I could start off. I don't see hands going into the air. Oh, there's a hand in the air. Go
I
Tim.
have like 1,000 comments. These are great presentations. Thank you, all three. Tanya, you really struck a nerve with me because I was nominated, I was volunteered to co-chair my local union, and my co-chair is an African-American performance poet. I'm a writer and editor at the National Writers Union. And he and I have talked extensively about the optics and what really turns out to be how we feel about each other, because I'm an old gray hair, he's a lot younger, and it's easy for me to say, well, here's what we're going to do, Raymond, but, you know, we've talked and said, that's not how we're going to run it. We've got to really see each other as equals. We've got to, and I've said to him, I'm going to learn from you as much as you can learn from me, and it's been, I don't want to say exhilarating, it's been liberating. I mean, for us to talk about it openly, which I don't think I've ever done before in a union setting, but we were asked to lead the union because of, you don't need to know. And it's been really great, and it's a struggle every day.
Yep.
For me to overcome my own, you know, oh, I know everything, you know what I mean? Because I've been chair before, you know. Anyway, so it's not a question, but I wanted to thank you for it because it was very, very helpful for me. I have
Would you like to respond?
Thank you. That's awesome. Stay on path.
I have a quick question for George. George, I wonder if you heard about the Progressive Alliance that took City Hall back from Chevron Oil Company in Richmond, California, in the Bay Area. Have you heard about that struggle?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, great, because that to me, it's a little bit of Sweden there.
A little bit of
Sweden, a little bit of Norway. I mean, they've really, I don't know if people don't know, Chevron Oil ruled the city for 100 years, and they ruled the town. It was corporate ownership. And these greens and reds and, you know, and LGBTs and all, civil rights and so on, they got together and they very slowly, they took one city hall seat, then a second, then a third, then the mayorship, and now they have the mayor and supermajority, and they've really transformed the city. If you'll forgive me for plugging it, I've published the mayor's story about how they did it, and it's really like what your presentation. It's a very useful lesson for all of us how we can take power from the 1%, but it's a long, hard struggle, and they had to overcome these differences among all these different groups and identities, and there was a lot of tears and you know, accusations along the way. It's been about a 12-year, 14-year struggle. But it's been really, really been great taking Richmond. So I'm glad you heard about it.
Or did you want to answer George? Okay.
I guess I was wondering what the correct moral and emotional reaction is to imperfect leaders, right? Because like I was listening on the radio a couple of years ago to analysis of like Pope Francis, right? And they'll say, well, he's trying to change the hearts of Catholics without changing the structure, right? So he's like, please be slightly less mean to gay people, or women who have abortions, but we're not actually going to change the language, right? And so he's trying to change the hearts without changing the structure, right? And then Obama's like, well, let's kind of do incremental progress and get Wall Street on our side, but kind of, but it was trying to change the structure, it was not changing the hearts and minds of the American people. And I was like, well, they're kind of both working on it, and neither one's like perfect, you know. And then we hear all these stories about like, oh, David Bowie dies. Like, people are really excited about him because he helped them with their gender identity. Like, yeah, but he was a rapist, you know. So then it's like those the internal, oppressive. Like, he was good in some ways, but not good in others. And I feel like progressive people I know who want to fight fascism get so shut down. Like, they look to like this person, and I'll be like, well, let's support what's good about them. Like, well, that's a sellout, we just get trapped in that crap. And I'm like, well, do I donate $5 to Elizabeth Warren a month, or do I sign a petition, or do I go to one protest, or I don't know. Like, I don't know how to. I'll just be nice. I'll model niceness, and I can handle that. Like, I don't know. What do you do? Like, because I think it's so easy to get shut down because you hear, like, your favorite author has been Me Too. Like, what do you do?
Let's hear some responses to that. What do you do, and what about imperfect leaders?
Well, we're always going to have imperfect leaders.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
Like,
that's a given.
because we're all imperfect. Just
speak for yourself.
Well, because
Yes.
present
Present company
and
excluded.
I keep being called an idiot. Like, well,
Right.
why do you support them? Because you're being stupid now. And I'm like, well, I can't run this by myself with my 2 little kids in a small town.
Okay, let's hear some substantive answers from the panelists, because it seems like an evocative question.
I'm going to let you chew this first, because I
Okay.
think it's more in your wheelhouse. I'm thinking of a lot of things, but I'm really curious what you're going to say.
So, I don't have a brilliant answer. The answer that I have is, like you said, there is going to be imperfection. And for me, the question that comes in my mind is, how is making sure that someone is a perfect leader supporting a system that is like supporting oppression? I really believe that it is when we think about whiteness and white cultural practices, it is like, it's gotta be perfect. It's gotta be lined up and on point. When we think about relational, it's like, okay, it can be a both and. This person is not perfect. And that is actually the truth. We're never going to be perfect. And it's interesting, it's like, where do you draw your line of, I can't support this person anymore? And that becomes a value place for me. That I have respect for a lot of leaders. And Dr. Martin Luther King, prime example. Man was a womanizer. And I will not throw all of his thinking out because, so it's, how do you hold the both and? So that's my non-brilliant answer. What do y'all got?
Well, my alternative is collective leadership, actually.
Yes.
I think that it is a kind of cultural disadvantage we have in this country, especially with People magazine and all, to keep focusing on individuals. And I think it's actually a mistake to do it in a number of ways. For one thing, it leaves us vulnerable in the way that you described yourself. And for another thing, it leaves the movement vulnerable, because even though Dr. King was the most important influence on my life, nevertheless, it meant that he was a sitting right, he was going to be assassinated. It was just so clear. And he knew that. And that's so if you get a top of the movement, you can take the top off, and then you can decapitate the movement. So it makes the movement too vulnerable, and it makes individuals too vulnerable to have that person try to personify something that is way, way, way bigger than that. So I'm into collective rather than individual leadership.
And I'll just add, I think a new generation is really trying to live that.
Yes.
You mentioned the movement for Black Lives. The movement for Black Lives took a lot of heat for not catapulting up one individual to serve as the face of the movement. And I know 2 of the 3 co-founders of the movement for Black Lives, and that was really deliberate. And I think it was actually really strategically smart for that very reason. There have been some people who tried to make themselves the leader, appoint themselves, but the three original co-founders were very deliberate about not being the only faces of the movement. And I think you have the same criticism of Occupy, and you have some of the same criticism of the Parkland kids who have been really clear. You know, Emma Gonzalez had a moment, but then all of a sudden there were lots of other people too. So I think that this generation is trying to approach change in a much more collective fashion than sort of the civil and women's rights movements that we're all familiar with.
And what we know actually of those collective movements, the truth of those movements are that they were not held by one person.
That's right.
The system and the oppressive system put that person out as the leader. We know that that movement even before was never held by one person.
Yeah.
I appreciate everybody's presentation. So many things to consider, but Tanya, I particularly appreciate yours because I feel like I live in this space as well. So I'm a sociologist, so of course my bread and butter is structure and policy, and I always want to make sure to come back to structure, especially in this moment of hyper-individualism, right? And sort of neoliberal, like, I mean, in my classes, in some ways, like, part of my work is to help people see structure, because if you can't even see structure, you only have the level of individual. However, on the other hand, I also spend a lot of time in spiritual communities of various kinds. And so really for me, that's kind of, I feel like I wander back and forth, right? I spend time with my sociologists, my activists, right, friends where we do a lot of work on structure. But then I also spend a lot of time with my spiritual friends and hippy-dippy folks, right? Let's work our consciousness, right? The Audre Lorde quote is one of my favorite quotes, and I spend a lot of time there. But what I find is like there's this tension between the two. And so a lot of times when I'm in this activist space, I'm like, why are we all so angry? Right? Like what? Maybe we need to spend a little more energy paying attention to our inner work and our consciousness. And sometimes when I hang out in spiritual communities, I can see that sometimes we swing the pendulum too far. You know, and I hang out with my New Age friends, and they're perfectly happy to spend all day on consciousness. And if anybody brings up race or structure, you're divisive and you're a buzzkill, right? And so I'm always walking back and forth between this tension of like, and I often in my own work I call it the politics of consciousness, right? We have to work on our consciousness, but there's a politics to it. So I really appreciate how you're trying to bring those together. And especially right now with this hyper-individualism, I sometimes worry about like, how do I hold that place of spirit and consciousness without allowing it to be co-opted into another depoliticized form of individualism? So I guess my question would be, you know, sort of how have you found like that space of holding the tension, you know, between the two? And to kind of expand the question, I actually was thinking about the way that your presentation was reflecting on the work that you all were doing in Demos. Because if part of what's upholding the structure is our internalized oppression, and what our dial tells us is what we're comfortable hearing. And so if we only speak to what we're comfortable hearing, and we're not doing that work with internalized oppression, we can only message in some ways to internalized domination. And then in what way are we catering to internalized domination and not pushing ourselves enough to do the work that we need to do? So I guess in some ways it's a question kind of for both, like how do we, you know, speak to our values while shaping our values while making sure we're still trying to kick out that other leg?
Another good one for substance.
I think the first question was to you, and then to me.
Okay.
Bradley.
I actually thank you because what you just spoke, I'm like, oh, that's what I've been doing all this time. So thank you for mirroring that for me and helping me know that I'm not by myself.
No, not at all.
What feels true to me is that we actually are living the straddle all the time, and we just act like we're doing either or. Besides the fact that Tanya, in this black body, that race, working class, living middle class, queer, this is an individual that is doing all of this, but is in relationship to the world outside and inside of her. And so it really, I don't know what else to do than to do the internal while holding, because I'm in relationship. And we actually do this all the time. Part of my spiritual practice is, there's a quote, and I'm not gonna get it right, but it's like, we are both a drop in the ocean and the ocean itself. And so, like, we can't not do that. We are acting like we have this belief, this ideology that's been put on us, that we are trying to do either or. The truth is that both are true. So, I don't know how, I feel like I'm just living what is going on in this body and in this mind. And I have to stay, it is a tension. And I somehow have learned to sit with it. Yeah.
So a couple things, at Demos, we actually are contracting with Tanya for our next phase of our, when Heather McGee became president, we went on a real racial equity transformation internally and did a lot of work as a staff internally before we ever did any external work related to racial justice or racial equity. And so we did everything from internalized racism to how, as supervisors trainings, how to deal and navigate when somebody does a microaggression in a meeting, like all kinds of internal work. And we did that because and a lot of historical, the whole package, but we didn't ignore the individual practice of the way we all show up, and kind of trying to peel away the layers and understand that. And the reason we did that is we deeply believed that unless we sort of focused on ourselves and our organizational culture, which we went through a major change, everything from our hiring practices, which we completely redid, to our dress code, there was not a piece of the organization that this did not touch. And we did that because we realized we're a policy organization, but in order to be authentic and actually know what we're doing in the outside world and create the kinds of change we want to have, we had to actually make sure our staff really understood what was happening, both within themselves, within the organization, and then in the outside world. So in terms of these messages, so this is one, we think of this as sort of the first step, and this is also a political, this is in the orbit of, we're trying to get, for example, we're working really closely in Ohio on the criminal justice campaign, which is probably one of the most radical, if it passes, criminal justice reform policies in the nation. We're also working in California, Minnesota, and Indiana. So we're trying to make good stuff happen in the midst of really crappy times. Demos has always believed that like change happens when you have ideas and action coming together. So this is about us helping change hearts and minds through the way we talk and the way we argue for good stuff to happen. That said, at the end of the day, the United States desperately needs some kind of racial healing and restitution process. Mm-hmm. Because so much of what we hold as individuals has never been discussed in this country. And just looking at the persuadables and how easy it is for people to toggle back and forth between competing ideologies says that like we're not all, there is no story that we all share in this country. And that's good in some cases, but when it comes to understanding race especially and how it still deeply, deeply shows up in all of our systems, in all of our individuals, in our politics, everywhere, we have to do that work. But we also have to win some elections and keep our democracy from collapsing.
And I can offer what works in my life. I'm in a campaign group that does both that kind of work. So we're both involved in a campaign. We're going to win, I think. We won our first campaign. We're going to win our second campaign. And at the same time, we lift up, well, it's a Quaker organization, so lifts up spirituality. We've been known to pray before we're getting arrested. The police are getting the handcuffs together, and we're praying out there in the middle of the institution, of a bank, for example. And so that ability to synthesize, I would wish for you, because it's just wonderful to be able to grow spiritually and be able to make a difference at the same time.
Yeah. And the Quakers have historically provided a lot of leadership around that process.
I want to pull out one basket question for all three of you that kind of pulls out the themes, and you asked it as like in your empty right column, George, of like, what's the vision? And I don't mean the vision of the better society, because I bet we have some real commonalities here. But what I really want, more than anything, is a powerful mass movement that will be transformative on all the systems of oppression and unjust power in this country, that is multiracial, cross-class, but almost by definition, to be all that, needs to be working class led a lot. Needs to be full of working class people and all kinds of collective leadership from the working class. So that's what I'd like to see. What would it look like? How, like, given that this is the society we're in, with our history of racial divide and conquer and permeating racism and classism, what do you see, not the end game of that movement winning, but what do you see that movement looking like? Where are the signs that it's could emerge? What would happen if it started to really happen? You know what I'm asking?
I have a clear idea about that.
Do you?
Yeah, I do, which is because I was brought up working class, and therefore it's all about practicality, getting something done. Where's the result, right? Rather than the process. Somehow we'll trust the process. We'll somehow do it, right? So, and that's where it might come from, right? So, campaigns really work that way. That's campaigns bring working class disposition to the forefront, because there's got to be an outcome. There's got to be a result. So how are we going to make a change? Some kind of cooperatives do that same thing as well. But I think one reason why the Nordic countries made their change was because they were working class led and they were results oriented. They had a vision of a very different society that they were going to set up, and they went ahead and set it up. But they did it in a kind of let's get shit done way of going about things, and that maintains working class leadership. One reason why the Democratic Party is so popular in our country is because we've, since civics, seventh grade, middle school civics, been told that's the way to get things done. And so the unions, working class people, and so on, well, that's the way to get things done. And Chevron's a problem, that's the way to get things done, is to build a party, and so on, so on, so on, so on. However, what we now find is that especially among working class people, there's a realization that's not the way to get things done. The Democratic Party abandoned the working class, which is why my working class brother voted for Trump, because he said that now I realize that was a mistake, but I couldn't bring myself to vote for Hillary because I knew more abandonment was down that road. We have voters absolutely not voting. More people didn't vote than did in the 2016 election. I don't think it's because they didn't know there was an election going on, right? But the cynicism that is, I think, correctly held by the working class in this country about politics is problematic for middle class people, including middle class people here, because there's a wish not to be cynical here and a hope that maybe the Democrats can come through somehow. Even though it's empirically shown in the Princeton study that the Democrats are abandoning the project and have been run by the owning class for many, many decades. So I think the movement that you're what the movement will look like that you're talking about will be one that where the dynamism is coming from campaigns that can be won. The electoral process not, but the campaigns in the contestation in the streets, in the contestation in the nonviolent revolution that working class people are capable of waging. And that is what, A, will deliver a different society, but also will make sure that the people who want to get shit done will remain in the leadership of that, because that's where we come from.
I see other hands, but I want to ask the other panelists to answer my question, but also I think it would be really great to hear some interaction. I hear commonalities, but I bet there's also disagreement, so it's okay to hold off on the questions a little longer and say, so, Timmy, what do you think about what George just said about
I don't know that I have an answer for your question.
Really?
I have to think about it a little bit.
Okay.
But my response to what you said, I hear it, and I'm worried that there are some missing intersections. When I think about my parents, their friends, the communities that surround as Black working class people, they are still very much bought into the Democratic Party,
Yes,
because that's the only party that's
They did not vote for Trump.
They did, not even close. And I get to listen to weekly the anger that comes from my family around Trump and the people who did vote for him. And that to me feels like one of those, if there was a chance that a working class movement across race could happen, it got split with this.
Yeah.
This, because it's sort of like, well, y'all chose wrong. And so I think there's some intersections that we have to keep considering as we have this.
That's what I was going to say too. It's really important to put the word white in front of working class in the story you were talking about, because the Black working class and by and large the Latino working class voted for Clinton. And Clinton's median income voter was much less than Trump. So we really do have to get away from this idea that somehow the white working class is what catapulted Trump into office. He won white college-educated men, which is a fact we overlook constantly. So, movement of, I don't think there will ever be a movement. I think there will be movements. And I actually, I tell this story a lot. So my first boss at Demos was a quintessential baby boomer. If there was a protest, he was in it. You know, from anti-war to civil rights to women's movement, and he talked about it all the time, and I never understood what the heck he was talking about. And I was like, I'm never going to see this kind of thing in my lifetime. About 5 years ago, I was like, okay, yes, I'm seeing it. I saw it in Black Lives Matter. I see it in the Dreamers and the immigrant rights movement. It's happening in Fight for 15, which is a working class movement across race, but primarily led by people of color, especially women of color. You see it in the domestic workers. You see it in the Me Too and the March for Women's Lives, which, with a lot of work, actually put forward a very inclusive vision of feminism and ideology. That was not an accident. So I actually am, despite the cynicism in which I'm naturally gravitated toward, I'm actually optimistic, because I actually think we are seeing a burst of civic engagement that I've never seen in my lifetime, that I'm hearing kind of echoes. You know, I don't hear a lot of baby boomers asking me, why aren't people out in the streets anymore? I used to get that question all the time, anytime, every baby boomer. I just don't understand, why aren't y'all out in the streets? Okay, well now that people are out in the streets, and that's really important. And campaigns are really important. I also still think electoral politics is extremely important, because our laws are written by one of the two parties. But movements pressure those parties, and and the decline of unionization has been a real detrimental impact in having working class solidarity. Because I think the biggest threat that unions pose is solidarity, not that they actually bargain for more of the profits that workers make. I think actually the political function they serve in society that is such a threat to people who have long been opposed to unions.
All right, yeah.
So, thank you. This is all like bringing up all kinds of different thoughts, and like each time each one of you says something. So I want to sort of dig in, sort of following up some ways with Betsy's question, and also like what you all have been saying in terms of kind of how to think about building the sorts of movements or movements or movements of movements or whatever it is, and what role would campaigns, which I see as kind of grassroots organizing in some ways, but yes, campaigns are trying to achieve a goal. How to, and to what degree having a vision of change broadly matters, like if that's not what we're seeing as much here. Because I mean, some people know, I came out of like many years of labor as well as labor community organizing, a lot of campaigns, and a lot of different thoughts of what campaigns are. And so, I guess the question to me is, what's the role? Because the last thing, that you said was about the elections matter, because we need to have immediate change, right? And in a lot of ways, which I agree. And then I also see how often, because, and particularly within the labor movement, the most immediate attacks that people are under really impact the ability to have a longer-term vision of change and how to do sort of deeper organizing that might help get us there. So what is the balance of that? What has been the main obstacle to building this sort of movements, but then also how can we at the same time dealing with immediate attacks that we're trying to fend off against, still be able to build, or do we need to build, what I would call deeper organizing? I mean, I would make the case that unions should be doing broad-based worker education, right, throughout their membership and leadership. They don't do it and haven't done it for a long time because they feel like it's a luxury. So how do these movements go beyond the immediate, like, either this is what we need to stop, right, or here's how we need to mobilize people for like a very specific action. Where have you seen that work? So that
the first thing that springs to mind is all of within sort of the new civil rights movement, right? Black Lives Matter and its panoply of organizations and people are really using both. So I think of the really powerful judicial and attorney general fights at the state and local level that groups like Color of Change have completely won and turned and gotten rid of these bad actors, right? So that's an electoral strategy, but it's embedded in a larger sort of structural reform about criminal justice, and it identifies all of the levers of change, and one of which is, progressives have not really been paying a lot of attention to judicial and attorney general elections by and large at the state level. And those folks are extremely important in terms of sentencing and rooting out racial bias in the criminal justice system. At the same time, those organizations are also doing lots of other kinds of work, including a lot of the hearts and minds work. So I think what, to me, I try and avoid is the idea that all of us have to do all of it. It's important that the movement has all of it, but that we all have our lanes. Like, I work for a policy organization, right? That's my lane. That doesn't mean that I, as an individual, don't think hearts and minds work is important, but when I get up, I know what my job is. And my job is to fight for policy change, and my theory of change and my organization's theory of change is that we need to be deeply embedded in the progressive movement and people on the ground doing grassroots organizing and being helpful to that, but we also have to get the chattering class and the leaders of the Democratic Party to think and behave differently. And those are the two worlds that we try and change. And that's like my universe, and people don't expect me to really play another role, and I'm really clear that those are the two areas that I'm trying to use to make change happen.
I think that there's tremendous lot to be learned still by most people about how to do campaigns, actually. Campaigns is a craft in itself that got to be really well understood in the 60s because people were doing it so much and learning from each other. Oh, well, we failed in Albany, Dr. King said, because of this and this, so we'll do it differently in Birmingham, and then boom, breakthrough, that kind of thing. Then it dropped out of sight by and large. Direct action campaigns dropped out of sight. And even though there was a tremendous victory in the 70s with nuclear power that Betsy was involved with, by and large, people haven't been studying campaigns. So people will go out on a mobilization, a big, protest, but I don't think accomplished anything. I don't know a single protest that has gotten anything done. So it's actually campaigns, sustained campaigns that are escalated over time that put somebody in a place where they either have to give up or they have to concede. And that's what I'm talking about, campaigns. And then policy objectives get advanced. And if people do the internal work, for example, my group does anti-racism workshops because there are a lot of white people in my group who need to really work on that. And we work on a lot of our interpersonal shit, and that we see as part of our contribution. That's part of our political work. I'm so happy to hear about the process that Demos did, and it sounds like that's a model for a lot of organizations. So I think we can do multiple things within the context of a power force that's called campaigns. And campaigns build movements. Right? And then the question is, can movements work together to go over the top, as the Nordics did? And that's why my book is so important.
No! Very nice. Everything I've said is why my book is so important. Everything. Sleepy giant.
The only thing that I would add, I appreciate what you said. Everybody has their lane. My worry is that some people have given up the idea of choosing a lane, and they're like, "This is just awful."
That's true.
And so how do we
Head
get
in the sand.
people actually involved and choosing a lane to be in, so that they can be a part of campaigns that
Yeah.
build movements?
We're running low on time. I see Jesse and Kieran. Are you taking your hand down now?
Oh, no, I just thought we were out of time, so we'll go ahead.
No, let's squeeze in a couple little more interchanges. Go to the last second.
My question directly follows your comment. As somebody who is always frustrated about inequality but never knows what to do, sociologist, I study it all day, I can write papers about it, but then when it comes to actually action, I'm always I'm cynical. I vote, I do the normal stuff, but I never feel like I know how to make a change. And I feel like you guys are experts on this, while keeping our jobs and trying to get tenure and all of that. What are the things we can do on the side, not a full-time organizer or anything, that would be most effective in your minds?
Whatever makes you feel like you have agency and effectiveness is what you should do. So if you like to write, then write an op-ed for your local paper. Whatever you feel powerful doing is what you should contribute. Because we need it all. Yeah. And it all makes a difference. What is I bet you know it, a pebble on the water, something.
Yeah, it's Robert F. Kennedy.
Right? It's not one thing. There's no silver bullet. What we need is people to be engaged in doing something. And so whatever you do, if you're doing something, it's making a difference, would be what I would say to you.
Yes, and that is, yes, do the thing that moves you, and hold a vision for what you actually are working towards. I have this thing, I'm like, I think we are always working about this problem, right, and we forget to look around and see what we're actually working towards. I'll work hard on this because I'm en route to this.
Yep.
And so, what is the thing that you actually are going for?
Don't let family members and administrators make you hate yourself for being a professor. That's the number one thing.
Can people up the page? Let's give
No
Kieran the last
internalized oppression about what you do for a living.
So Kieran,
I just had a quick comment. Tanya, you had mentioned that idea of internalized domination, and Tamara, you had talked about how we're sort of missing a national narrative about race and racial justice. And it just seems like, for me, one of the obstacles that we have is that white people in general
I'm really interested in community work and at my college as well, just raising awareness with white people in particular about all those pieces that are missing, that race was invented to divide and conquer, and if they can ultimately, you know, recognize that, then participating in a movement to be undivided and unconquered, I think is possible.
Ooh, I see all three of them.
Totally.
Yes.
We don't have the same facts.
Yeah.
We do not have the same facts in this country, and it's a real problem.
And Karen's brought solutions. Well, perfect.
Yes. Books will change the world.
All right, let's thank our awesome panel.